there we go. Okay, so just a quick, if you don't know anything about MHA, we've been around for about 20 years. We have more experienced individuals on our staff. We tend to be in the 20+ year range. Been doing business continuity for quite a while myself. I've grown up in the IT world, across from systems administration to management, director level areas, and then have been with MHA for, this is going on my 11th year with them. So you can see the goal that we have really is to provide a customized solution to organizations. And we do have some tools and things that we'll talk a little bit about, but that's not why you're here. If you want to learn more about us, feel free to jump onto our website. Just to kind of give you an idea of the background that we have, you know, we try to leverage the experience that we have kind of across multiple different verticals, with some larger, smaller, medium-sized companies. So we feel like we've got a pretty good client base and experience level in seeing a lot of different things that help. Again, making it so that it's customizable to your organization and the information that we have, so it's not just a one-size-fits-all. So again, from an MHA perspective, we kind of do the entire gamut of business continuity, from assessments all the way to assisting with maintenance. And that can be point solutions, that can be helping run your whole program, whatever that may be. We also have some IT related services that we will do as needed. But for what you all are worried about, probably it's really more around that business continuity side. So that's really where our focus is. And then we will assist where we have skill sets. Sometimes we'll do some project management for folks if necessary, to assist in moving their programs along. So what we really want to talk about today is performing a risk assessment. You know, what does that mean? We're going to assume that there's a varied level here, that some of you have probably been very extensive in your risk analysis. Maybe some of you are relatively new. Try to take a medium level approach. But if you have more detailed questions or want, please jump in and ask. But we'll kind of talk about what that means and how to do that related to your organizations to make it specific rather than just kind of a generic. Then we want to take a little bit closer look at some important items which we're seeing that are not always considered in your risk assessments, which are really supply chain and vendors, staffing, understanding your risk profile. We'll talk about that kind of through the whole presentation. Physical security, insurance, and things like that, just to kind of make sure those are being addressed as opposed to just pure, you know, the business continuity process side of things. And again, if there's anything else that you'd like to bring up, feel free to do so. So I want to make sure that, just to kind of level set us all, this is kind of something we like to really look at, right? Is there's this balance of resilience and looking at it from a risk and then a compliance and a readiness perspective, right? We want to make sure those things are balanced. Sometimes what we see is we focus so much on being ready that it actually outweighs the actual risk that's going on. And so that balance is really an important function from our perspective, really understanding it. And one of the things that we have seen is there are, you know, some views, and I don't think necessarily inappropriate, that some of the things that we do in business continuity, from a formal risk assessment to BIAs to other things, are just outdated and really don't provide any value. We don't necessarily agree with that. We think we need to modify how we're doing this and not necessarily do it the same way we've done it for the last 25 years. But understanding risk allows us to come up with appropriate plans and resiliency that meets the organization. And so we'll talk more about that as we move forward. But we still think that risk assessment and understanding that is important, rather than just figuring out things to prevent or putting plans in place. We really do try to look at standards. You know, one of the things, depending on your organization, you may be under some of the standards that you see there. So that's an important thing to consider. Sometimes the level of risk or the preparedness that we need is based on that standard, whether you're a public company, a private company that has to follow standards, whether you're trying to be ISO certified or whatever. And then, you know, again, looking at the various business continuity components and what are the risks across all of those is something important that we like to consider. So as you're going about your your assessment, consider what standards do you need to use. Are there any regulatory requirements that you have, the FINRAs or the ISOs or NIST, et cetera, or SEC? Or is it just something that would make your organization better because of what you do, depending on the vertical? All right. Let's kind of just make sure we're level set on really from a risk management perspective. What we're really concerned about is identifying the threats, the situations that occur that could really cause some type of business function outage, whatever that may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be, a natural threat or, the active shooter things that get so much in the news. There could be other things, but we really want to look at across the board. What are the human issues that are going on, both risks as people making mistakes, to if people aren't available, to natural events, right? We think about those a lot, especially in today's days with the hurricanes that we've had in the recent past, as well as the storms that are coming through. We tend to do pretty good with those. The technology issues, given the interdependency that we have, any kind of chemical issues, especially also thinking in terms of brand and all of those things that are related. We need to understand what those external threats are as well as what the internal threats are. And then determining what we were going to do to minimize the impact and what's going to be mitigated and what will not be mitigated. Not everything has to be addressed. The goal here, though, is to make sure we understand what it is and make conscious decisions. So that's really, and we do this every day in our lives, right? We get in a car, do we decide to put our seatbelt on or not? It's going to be down the road. Are we going to put our children in a car seat because if we're just going 3 blocks down the road, are we going to do that? Again, that's based on our risk profile. It's based on what we think is going to happen and what we're comfortable with. So in our organizations, we want to do the same thing. One of the things I think it is important to again, to kind of level set us and think about really where things are happening today, right, is what are the actual crises that organizations are going through. It's one thing to go look at what are some of our risks, what are some of our threats, what's going on, but also looking at history is important, and we'll talk about that. But as you kind of see this kind of crisis spectrum, if you will, one of the big things that we're seeing are not necessarily traditional crises as we would think about them, right? Physical or safety issues, but you can see a lot of mismanagement issues happen. There's discriminatory or other type of political issues that actually affect an organization. The other important item to look at is we think of our crises in terms of just sudden, quick events, right? A storm, a safety issue that just occur that we really can't plan for or don't know about. The reality is a lot of the crises and events that happen have been sitting there smoldering, and you all probably know in your organization, there's those things that are just always going on that are just uncomfortable that nobody maybe wants to talk about, that they're just kind of ignored, hoping that they will go away. Those tend to then rise up into a crisis that has to be dealt with, as opposed to addressing them before maybe a major incident occurs. So as you're going through, as you go through your risk assessment, as we talk about that, think of your own organization. What are the things that just can't be planned for in the sense of when they occur, there's no preventing it, versus those things that are happening that maybe could be prevented because they're known but ignored. Another way to think about this as we go about it is just kind of flipping sometimes our mindsets on what to think about is kind of a prioritization of crisis management or event response. Clearly, life safety is the most important thing. Following that is stabilizing whatever the incident is, making sure that the building's property, it kind of goes along with life safety, is preserved, and then restoring your business function. So as you think about risk management, sometimes we go from the bottom. What are the risks to our business? And we spend a lot of time there because we assume that our emergency management teams are worrying about safety or incident command and all of that, which may be appropriate. But from a business continuity perspective, You may want to flip that and consider what life safety does. Again, people are some of our important resources. Without the people, having systems and availability really doesn't mean anything. So just an idea as you're thinking about it that may help view some of those risks. Okay, so now thinking in terms of kind of the cultural side of risk, because really one of my favorite sayings, is if you don't really know the direction or the goal that you have, whatever you do doesn't really matter. So that long-term vision is really important, and understanding the culture in which you're at. So one of the first things that you want to look at from an organization is your organization's profile, your organization's risk culture. Are you a Wild West, right? If you think about startups, new companies, they're okay changing very quickly. They're okay taking a lot of risk, both from a business perspective and maybe even from an overall business continuity perspective, because they're trying to be agile to find where they're at, versus a company that's been around, a financial company that's been around for 100 years. Right? Their risk is probably a lot lower. So do you understand what that is? Is risk acknowledged, or is it a culture where we just ignore it and we like to put our head in the sand and hope it will go away? One of my favorite sayings, along with the vision, is hope is not a strategy. Right? If you just hope, you're just letting the dice roll, and we'll deal with it when we deal with it. Well, that's fine if that's your organization's culture and that's the best way to do with it. Understanding that, because then your risk assessment will be different. Again, are you a proactive or reactive type of organization? Many organizations want to be proactive when in reality, everything they do is reactive. Trying to get things done and prepared ahead of time is very, very difficult, but it's really easy, and everybody's really good at jumping in when there's an emergency. Again, that's gonna help you understand maybe what the remediation actions would be, but also may help understand what risks you really need to deal with. And I think this goes on with the next one is just the risks just continue to build up until there's an audit that says you have to fix them, right? Or there's a disruption that happens, and then you turn around and say, well, I guess we should fix it. Again, if that's the organization's culture, understanding that, what we're trying to encourage is it's much better to close the door before letting things out than to say, well, I guess we better start closing the door so it doesn't happen again. I think this goes back to also the acknowledgement of risk. Is it okay to demonstrate what our weaknesses are and what our potential issues may be, or is that something that isn't understood? Just recently listened to the podcast related to an organization that had the culture of you didn't bring up issues, and then the consequences of all of that. And it was just very well, the behaviors of management was very much, if you bring up issues, it was, you're not a team player, even if you came up with a solution. And then probably one of the other things just underlying all of this that might be considered a risk area, but isn't always addressed, is what's the alignment between IT and the non-IT units of the business? Is IT just kind of out there doing their thing and trying to keep the lights running, not really understanding what the needs of the business are? And then from a concepts perspective, and we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail, but to kind of kick them off is, what is your risk? What's your risk appetite versus your risk tolerance, which we'll talk about. Your mitigating controls. How are you preventing the consequences of risk from occurring? And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about residual risk. What's left after you've done everything. All right. So it's kind of this risk appetite versus risk tolerance. It's an important thing to understand, because one of the things has to do with what is our overall risk, as we talked about. Well, are we a risk-averse organization, or are we a risk-accepting organizations in general? That helps then determine what we are or aren't going to do. But then that's the appetite. We tend to accept risk, right? My son is one of those that accepts risk. He's in the Army. He loves to go out and he likes to shoot guns and he likes to run around, loves to run on his mountain bike. So he does all of that. One of my other children, is the one that puts the helmet and the pads all the way through, because, doesn't really like to do that, just doesn't like to get out and is very much risk averse. But then we have the tolerance, right, which is specific to an event or specific to an area. Is what are we going to accept? So if you think about it, right, our appetite is we're okay with limited to no insurance, right, because we either have financial reserves or we know there's a low likelihood of an occurrence, or we're just okay because we've got that preparation elsewhere. But then when we look at it, we come back and say, okay, well, what does that mean to have high insurance? Well, what's our max deductible, right? Does high insurance mean a $5,000 deductible? Does it mean a $10,000? Does it mean $1 million? Or we're not going to worry about comprehensive insurance. We're just going to drive an older car and we'll buy another one because it's worth it to us to do so. So, those are where those two come together. And as an organization, we kind of would look at the same thing. Are we going to have a lot of insurance and we're not going to worry about preventing a business disruption, or do we actually need to have a lot of plans in place to prevent a disruption and allow us to immediately start business again, versus allowing a longer recovery? So when we think about risk mitigation in all of these things, it really is important to understand the difference between the various items that we have to look at. Risk acceptance, right? That's where a lot of organizations we call that ignoring risk. A lot of times they'll just pretend like, well, we're accepting risk, when in actuality they're ignoring it. Risk acceptance is not ignoring risk. It's consciously making a decision that we're not going to do anything because we either have insurance or we have financial reserves, or it just doesn't make sense for us to do it. We'll deal with it when it occurs. Okay? Risk avoidance is the opposite, right? Now we're going to do everything we can to make sure that it never can occur. The impacts will not happen, right? It's typically the most expensive. It takes a lot of effort, but in the end, it may be worth it. It may be that, using a highly transactional organization, for example, on Amazon, they can't go down. So they're going to put a lot of effort into redundancy and resiliency in their computer systems because they have to be available all the time, as opposed to saying, well, if it goes down, we'll just take the hit. Other organizations, that may be okay. Or if a building is really not that important, they may not worry. They might just accept it. Well, if the building goes down, we're going to have to run out of our homes for a week or so. Won't be ideal, but we'll deal with it, as opposed to others that it's a highly customer-facing base that has to be there, a retail store, for example. Then we have risk limitation, right? That's kind of in between. We're going to do something to limit the risk. It may not completely remove it, but at least we'll be able to partially continue functioning if necessary. This is where most organizations spend most of their time, figuring out what is actually needed, right? It may be a short outage, but we can get back into a building relatively quickly, as opposed to never being out of the building. And the last one is risk transference, right? This is where you're paying a third party, right? This is the classic from an IT perspective. We don't want to run our own systems. We're going to give that to a cloud provider, or we're going to have SaaS solutions. It's their job now to limit the risk. It's not on us. It doesn't change the risk. It's just moving it somewhere else. And there may be other risks that come in that you have to address when you move it to a third party. That we'll talk about our vendor and supply chain management. This can be especially important from a risk transference perspective if it's not your core competency. Another good example of risk transference is, so many organizations now have third-party security firms. They don't want to have internal security. That's not their competency. Let's get somebody else to provide our security for us. And just to make sure that we understand kind of the common risks, some of the biggest ones anymore are human error and then breach and ransomware, right? Those are happening all the time. And the human error is almost impossible to fix or stop. The two of those, however, can be intentional and unintentional, right? The intentional, that's something that you want to try to prevent. The unintentional, that's just mental errors, right? Mistakes that people make. Welcome to being human. We try to do that through processes and procedures and training. But that's something that, as we look at our risk assessments, what are those potential unintentional consequences and errors, and what should we, if anything, have in place, or do we just plan for them? And then the last couple are reputational issues and technology issues. all of these are really probably the biggest ones that are happening today. Well, let's get into kind of the overall assessment and what we're doing and maybe what is important for organizations. These are kind of the 8 areas that we really kind of look at from an overall risk perspective from a process, right? Fire, life safety, physical, data security, networking, hardware, business continuity, facilities, and then your overall business. Thinking in terms of that for your organization. Again, fire, life safety may be something that is turned over to a different department. One of the important things, though, is really understanding what do they have in place, and have they addressed all of the potential risks and safety issues? Is there a program there? Is there something that needs to be considered? One of the things that we're seeing, a specific example that isn't always addressed, are those individuals who have special needs. While we think about that from an access perspective, and the ADA compliance and requirements that we have, there's also, in terms of fire, life safety, from a people perspective, are there people who, in case of an evacuation, do need special care? Are there people with special healthcare needs? You think in terms of diabetes or other medical conditions that may manifest themselves depending on the situation. Have those been addressed for your staff? Not, that often is assumed that it's okay, but at least consciously thought through. The physical security side, again, in our culture today, while we do focus on security, one of the things we kind of look at is, are we looking at security theater, or are we looking at actual security risks, right? And one of the examples that I use there from a risk perspective is I worked with an organization who you had to badge in, and there were security individuals at the front desk, but there was no gate. The badge was, you just had to show them your badge and hit the badge reader, but there was no prevention. And so in the middle of, in the morning, that is the busiest times, people are just coming in and kind of flipping their badge and walking on through. Anybody could have something that looked that way, flip up their badge and walk on through. So even though there was security, it really wasn't overly effective security, because the same security folks and individuals were also having to check in visitors. So they're just kind of glancing over as people are walking in. So, those are some of the risks you may want to look at when in a risk assessment. You may look at, and then, do we have security at the front door? Yes, check. Well, are we really looking at what that means, and is it really effective? And on the rest of the few of these, the data issues, the IT piece, depending on if you're an IT individual or not, again, I would turn around and really ask those hard questions. More around, not do you have backups and do you have data security, but have you actually demonstrated that it works and that it does exist, and what are the details around that? Same thing with resiliency. It really isn't a yes/no question. It's really around what is in place and what are the gaps, so that we understand, what might those be. For example, in IT disaster recovery, not can we recover our systems, but can we actually perform the functions that are necessary? So thinking in terms of like a manufacturing plant, if they have to print out certain procedures, or they have to print out certain documents in order to ship them to the next location, does the printing actually work? Often that's one of the things that doesn't happen. That's a risk, right? That might not be a big risk from a continuity perspective, but it is a risk from a business and operations perspective. Also thinking in terms of facilities. Again, this is kind of a EH&S or side, but looking at those things, not only from a fire, life safety and a physical security, but what are the areas that are necessary to be functional for that facility? We're going to get into that into the next slide. But are your facilities, what happens if one of them goes away? Do you have redundancy somewhere else? And this can be really difficult when it comes down to a manufacturing site, maybe certain distribution areas where one specific facility may be a single point of failure in your overall risk assessment. And then looking just kind of for your best practices. What do you really need? Do you need to be fully compliant on all of the standards? You need to be compliant. with all best practices, or is thinking in terms of like an ITIL standard or an ISO standard? Are you doing that because you need to be compliant, and so that's a risk because you'll lose your ISO compliance? Or are you just leveraging that to make your organization better? We tend to use guidelines and use standards so that they help make you better, but don't become dependent on them so that the standard becomes the issue, and your organization is handcuffed to the standard when it should be the opposite. The standard should help your organization become better. So around all of those areas, now we're looking at the various controls that you need to look at, your geography. What is around you, right? What are your neighboring companies? What goes on? This is kind of where the threats and risks come in, from a natural threat within your geography. Or are you over a flight plane? Do you have airplanes coming over? Is there a risk there? What about the roads? Do you have hazardous chemicals or trucks coming anywhere close that could get you shut down? Maybe it doesn't affect your building in and of itself, but if certain egress and ingress from a transportation perspective are impacted, what would that do to your organization? Right? Something to consider there. Your neighboring companies, are they a risk? One of the companies, an example of this that I saw, we were working with a company doing a threat and risk around one of their locations, and everything looked good. It was, just a normal industrial area. And so we started asking questions. Is there anybody here that could cause a disruption in allowing staff to come in, stopping vendors from delivering, et cetera? They're like, no. And we kept pressing. And the next thing I said, well, you know what? We think there's a government agency or something right next door. Didn't look like it. It looked like just a normal warehouse. And I said, well, how do we know that? He says, well, something happened, and within about a minute, the whole building was surrounded with a bunch of people in bulletproof vests and Uzis. Like, good to know. So we couldn't get any details, but we did clearly understand there was something of a secure nature close that could now cause an issue with this organization if there was a political event, or maybe there was something found out in that other organization. So those are the kind of things to look at from a neighborhood perspective. What about your utilities, right? Some of these things are really obvious, but sometimes we just assume, oh yeah, we're on regular power and we've never had an issue. But it turns out that you're only on one grid, or you have a special substation, and that's the only one. And if that goes away, power goes away. So really understanding all of that, and then all of the histories. But again, one of the other things I'd really like to hit on here is the people in business operations. One of the things from a risk assessment that we don't always see is not necessarily from a crisis perspective, but from a business operations perspective. Who are your most critical people? What will happen if you lose 2 or 3 critical people from the same department? I was sitting in a risk assessment with another organization, and I said, what are you most worried about? And the CIO pointed at 2 people and said, if they leave, I don't know what I would do. And that was literally the big, he goes, I really don't care about technology. I really don't care about this other stuff. I can figure that out. If they leave, I really don't know what I would do because there's so much knowledge in their heads. That turned out to be one of the highest risks that we identified. And then lastly, and here's the probability of occurrence. When is that really going to happen? And what's the likelihood? And what is the actual impact? So one of the things I would add here is, if you haven't done a BIA, or if you don't know your business process implications, doing these risk assessments can be really hard, because you might look at it and say, well, we have this huge risk that this building goes away and these people are going to be impacted and can't work. But if we don't understand what the impact of the organization of those departments are, now putting all of that overall risk assessment can be difficult. So all of these things actually do go together. And maybe this is a place to stop and also say, some of this, when we talk about a formal assessment, the formal assessment does not have to take forever, doesn't have to take months. You can have some good conversations with leadership, with people of the various departments, and get their feeling. Typically, somebody's gut check is usually 80% right. But digging into the details is really the important part of it, and coming up with that as opposed to just generic ideas. Do you have any weather history? No. Well, I live in Arizona, so do you need to worry about weather? No. Well, actually, we do need to worry about weather. We have things called microbursts that can take buildings out, or we have different floods that can come through that could stop people from getting to work. So we do have to look at the weather history, see what's going on, but it's again very specific to the area of the Phoenix metro that I happen to live in. I'm going to stop there for a second. Are there any questions? If we jump into one of the next areas. Okay, so one of the big things that we would suggest you look at from a risk perspective is the supply chain. The other ones we've spent 20 years dealing with, and we want to get into the specifics. But if you have not looked at your overall supply chain, this is probably an area in most organizations that is under represented in the risk assessment, and really spending some time understanding what those risks are. Today, because of lean practices and just-in-time shipping and the offshoring that we do in the global nature, the supply chain getting disrupted overseas can impact a lot of organizations here. And it may not be directly related to you. You may look at your supply chain and say, I get everything from all my local companies next to me or here in the same region. But the question that we would then ask is, what about them? Where are they getting their product from? And what happens if they can't get product? We actually have to start thinking about those 1 and 2 items removed from where we are. Because of the nature, most everything is coming from overseas or in some form or fashion, whether it's the end product or some raw material that's coming in. This can be actually one of the biggest impacts to an organization. Now we deal with a lot of medical firms, and we deal with a lot of manufacturing firms, and this is a big deal. When the hurricane hit a couple of years ago in Puerto Rico, many of the medical providers, hospital organizations, they became very low on certain medications because a lot of those are manufactured and stored in Puerto Rico and other hurricane impacting locations, and so they couldn't get things in fast enough. So understanding that can be a big deal. Even if you talk to the big medical distributors, well, I don't have to worry about them. We're a Medtronic or whoever. They could be impacted. So something to really consider, especially those risks that are outside of your control. Understanding that is important. So here's kind of an area that you really want to look at. What happens if there's a demand risk, a supply risk, a process risk within the network or an environmental? Really jumping down. If there's an area that you really do want to spend some time, this is where we would encourage you to spend the time understanding or work with your supply chain team to see if they have gone through this. Sometimes this is an area where people just kind of hope, and we assume that because of the global nature, we'll be okay. The next area is vendor risk. So supply chain and vendor are two different things, right? Supply chain really talks about how your product, how raw materials, whatever you need is moving to you. Now we're looking at vendors. Again, this is related to the supply chain side because you're probably going to look at your vendors within your supply chain. But there's also things outside of that, especially for the organizations that outsource a lot of functions, right? That, especially from an IT perspective, an easy one are the SaaS solutions, right? If you're relying on a cloud provider for your applications, well, what is their risks? What's their business continuity plan? What would happen if they were unavailable? What is the risk to your organization there? If you put some critical functions in, smaller and fewer vendors, where you have those critical vendors, who are they, and what are they doing to make sure that you can always be serviced? A real important piece to that, especially as we start seeing, your contact may be the same, but acquisitions and mergers and different things can happen where, what you thought was your local company is now just a small part of a much larger company, and do you understand what those impacts are? And really understanding what's the vendor resiliency. You might have a resiliency plan that says we're relying on them, but if they're part of that same event, what does that mean? Are they really going to be able to service you? And are you at the highest priority for them? One of the things we typically ask, is if you're dependent on fuel, what does your contract say about the fuel provider in the event of an event? Are you the big fish in the pond, or are you at the bottom? And those organizations that say, well, we have no idea, you should probably go check, because if you don't know, that probably means you're at the bottom, which means there's other organizations that are going to get their fuel first, which may impact, your ability to continue functioning. So this is kind of all of the questions here, and I know you all can read all of this, but really the criticality of your vendors and business partners, your internal supply chain. Have you prioritized them? What happens if a vendor crisis becomes an issue for you? You may be fine, but now your vendor is having an issue. Do you have backup? Do you have backup plans? Do they understand prioritization and what you're going to be expecting of them, and can they actually provide that service? And when we say that, this is not a sales question, right? This isn't going to your sales rep to say, will you do that? This is really getting the details of how you would do that, and making sure you understand that. And then can they help you and provide more services in case there's a crisis that you're going to ask them, as opposed to just the standard services that they provide you, on a normal day-to-day. Again, between supply chain and understanding the vendor's risks, probably some of the areas that I would spend some time looking at overall, because most organizations have probably got some of the basic risks mitigated. They may not have these. Again, it's just kind of a hope strategy. Again, the best example I can use there is when I talk to people about SaaS solutions, right? When they say, oh, I'm using Office 365, Microsoft will fix it for me. Sure, they will, but they don't guarantee it. And so what does that mean? What's the risk to you if your email goes down for a day? And what are you going to do? So understanding that can be very important. This is something that you can leverage, after the fact, to kind of look at all of the various, vendor risks and things that you can look at, from the details, right? Some of the red things are what we've been talking about, but some of the other pieces, right, from an overall vendor assessment is important. You can also leverage this for your internal consideration, right? Your human capital, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's talk a little bit about a little bit more detail of some of the staffing and individual items to consider. We've talked a little bit about staffing and people, right? Identifying those single points of failure, as I said. Do departments know who they're really truly dependent on? And sometimes even at a higher management level, they don't understand that. So again, I've had these conversations with multiple times in multiple organizations within probably the past 6 months. I'm sitting there and asking, what would you do with your people if there was an event? And inevitably, a department or two will come up and say, we're good. Everybody can work at home except for Mary. If Mary goes away, I'm not sure. And I always ask the question, well, what happens when Mary goes on vacation? Just waits for her to come back. That can be a really scary thing. That's a huge risk for an organization, something that probably should be noted. So, what teams are critical? What staff are critical? What can't be done without them, even when they go on vacation? Or when you hear, what happens when they go on vacation? Well, we just call them if we need them. Well, there might be a case when you can't call them. Understanding really what the minimal staffing for each process or department is really key, again, in your risk assessment. Can it really be done with 4 people, or is 10 the minimum? And sometimes digging into that takes a little bit of time, and again, but is really valuable, as opposed to saying, are we ready for a snowstorm? Well, if you live where it snows, you're probably ready for a snowstorm, but are you ready if 10 people aren't there? Pandemic planning. And when we say pandemic planning, not only do we mean the sicknesses, but just people's availability. An example that I use a lot was an organization that was in the middle of hurricane, and their organization was fine. They were up at a higher level. They were prepared. They knew everything that they were doing. But as part of the response to the hurricane and making sure they can continue to function, all the people were sent home. Well, probably 60% of the people actually lived in an area that was impacted by the waters that were coming in from the hurricane. And many of their homes were flooding, their basements were flooding. So we're on a call and we're talking about what needs to be either be continued to be executed, or what plans are in place, everything's okay. And all of a sudden, people just start dropping, saying, my sump pump isn't working. I've got to go take care of my house. Click. Yep, mine isn't either. Click. We went down from like 10 people to 3 within a matter of 15 minutes. And they just weren't available anymore. Had nothing to do with sickness, had nothing to do with the business itself. They were unavailable. But understanding what that minimal level allowed us to continue to work, because we understood that. So those are the risks to consider. What happens to your people if they can't be there? And this goes back to what we were just saying. And family independent needs may impact your staffing. Do people have special needs at home that maybe could impact their ability to work, especially if they're a critical person? Maybe they're a primary caregiver for a family member or a parent or a child. Again, we're not trying to deal with privacy issues. We're just trying to understand what we can do to support our business and support them. We just talked about the loss of staff in a non-emergency. And then public visibility of staff and leadership. What is your risk, right? Do you have highly visible individuals in your organization, whether it be in your nationally or whether it be locally? And is that something that needs to be addressed? How is your social media used for people in your organization? Those are key factors to consider for their safety and therefore your organization as well. So physical security, at your building. This goes along with health and safety, and we typically do a really good job here. But again, just some things to really think about from a building perspective if you hadn't. And maybe your facilities folks do this. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I was just doing an assessment, a safety assessment for an organization, and we were kind of walking around, and these things came up. They were kind of understood, but from a organization perspective, it got raised up. Things like, are there blind spots? Is there a security presence? What is the security presence? Where is the location? And one of the reasons was, we don't worry about, these blind spots. We don't worry about not having cameras on our exterior of the building because we're in a really safe location. Well, okay, that's fine. That goes back to your organizational risk profile. Are you okay with that? Maybe, maybe not. Depending on what you have there, this was an organization that had some very, very expensive equipment and product in their warehouse. So, and you could get into their storage location directly from the exterior of the building. Don't know that was the right solution in my opinion, but it was something we brought up. It was a risk. It would be easy to knock through a window, take some of the expensive equipment, and without a camera, you may not know, who or what. That also goes within the building. Are you an organization that uses cameras because it's the right thing to do from a safety perspective? An organization I had, they were against it. They only had a camera in their lobby. Outside of that, there were no cameras in their building. That to us seemed a little bit risky, more from a not because you were spying on people, but because if something did happen, again, this was a location that had a lot of proprietary information, did a lot of design work, had some expensive equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things to really look at very diligently, and I think with a disciplined approach. What about your organization culture, your social presence, all those things? Do you have high-profile employees? Do you have an issue, with employees with high risk personal issues? Again, we have to be sensitive to personal information and what's there. But if you have a individual who may be in a very sensitive court case, or maybe there's a custody battle going on, there's garnishments going on, that can add some emotional risk to an organization. That might not be with the employee, it might be with whom they're having to interact. And is that a potential security issue? Is it easy to get into the building, as I talked about? Do all of the security measures actually work? Do you need to add additional security measures? It's hard to say which specific things you need to do for your organization, because this is part of the overall assessment, and what we're trying to get to is look at it very specifically for your organization. Is your organization, look at like a Hobby Lobby or a Chick-fil-A, their social presence is, and their business culture or their leadership culture has some social risks to it, if you will, because of their opinions, right? So there might be a lot more demonstrations at some locations. What does that mean? Is that something that you need to address from a physical presence, or even from an organizational perspective? Any questions or any comments about that to this point? I would like to just make a note up here. I was kind of focusing on some of those other issues, but the appropriate evacuation capability and procedures. That's typically something that people understand really well. I just want to re-emphasize that as it relates to specific needs. When you're looking at your overall risk and what's happening to individuals, abled people who are have no access or mobility issues might not be an issue, but do you have plans in place for those that may have mobility issues or may have health concerns, and can't use the elevator? We have such a broad spectrum in our society today that we do have to take those into account. And so even though the procedures exist, again, it's not just a check mark that says, yes, they exist. The question always needs to be, are they functional and do they meet the needs of all the individuals? One of the areas from a physical security perspective that is very hard is visitors. How do you account for them? How do you know that they're there? And how do you even know that the staff that you have is in a building and that they're on site? We typically rely on our management team or supervisors, but do they even know that somebody went out to lunch or is in the building? So again, something to consider in your risk assessment. Kind of lastly, as we get into this, is insurance. And this may not be something that you're worried about. This may be something that the risk department is responsible for, but really did want to call it out because it's a big piece of your overall risk profile. Because organizations will just say, we've got insurance and we're dealing with it. A couple of the things to consider is, one, what do you actually have and what does that mean, right? We know we have business interruption insurance, we have liability insurance, and in today's day, if you don't have cyber insurance, you should make sure you do. That's absolutely huge, especially because a single event it could ultimately get to millions of dollars very, very quickly. But the key to the insurance piece as we're looking at our risk is, one, not only what's our risk appetite and our risk profile, so is it sufficient? And that might not even be your call. That's probably more the risk department's call. But you from a business continuity perspective or even a risk perspective want to make sure we understand that. But understanding what are the requirements. And this may be really important to push down to various departments if they could be impacted, by an insurance claim. Cyber is a really good example of that because there are typically notification requirements to your insurance company or to your provider. And if they're not done appropriately, that may nullify the claim or significantly reduce the claim, which could be a big issue. So really looking at that and understanding what's there and what it will and will not cover will also then help what remediation you can put into place. Going back to that risk limitation perspective, we're okay accepting the risk, but you know what? We do need to put certain tools or processes in place. Your insurance may require that. You may not just be able to open it up and just say, well, we've got it there, so it doesn't matter that we don't have any protections in place. They may require the protections before they pay out the claim. So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure there aren't any questions before I get to this last topic. So are there any questions, comments? Okay. So the last thing as it relates to your risk, so you've gone through all of that, you know all of your specifics, you're putting some remediation plans in place, and everybody feels really good. So the next step, really the more organizations as they get to a more mature level of risk analysis and risk mitigation, is this residual risk. And what we like to consider that is what's remaining after you've done all of your work. So it's really looking at there's still risk in the organization, whether you've ignored it or accepted it, I should say, whether you've completely remediated it, whether you've got some limitation, or you've pushed it to a third party, you've transferred it. There's still going to be some level of risk that's still there. Understanding that is really important, right? So that you can assess, are we within our risk profile, right? Or are we outside of our tolerance? Rather than saying we've done something so we're good, does anything else need to be done? And a way to consider that is, I kind of use this malware example. Is what are we trying to do, right? Well, we don't want malware from coming into our environment, right? What's the risk? Well, the risk is we could have a data breach, or we could have proprietary data leak, right? Then it's like, well, what level of risk are we willing to accept? Do we really have that much private data, or is it really just kind of public and it's more an inconvenience and it's only the private data of our employees that we're worried about. Again, what are we willing to accept? Then we come up with potential mitigating controls, right? We can just do training. Make sure you don't click on links. Make sure you're careful about what emails come through. Make sure you're careful about what you're sharing on social media. You can have monitoring tools in place to see what's happening on your network. Antivirus is out there. You might have a DMZ, right? You might isolate different servers or applications so that it's harder to get to. All of those things, are in your wheelhouse, and organizations do more or less of it. Then you start looking at, well, now that we've implemented, what's the state of our controls? What will really happen, and what would happen if a malware event came in, and are we willing to accept that? And then do you continue to implement additional controls, or are you just happy where you're at? Again, a very objective measure of looking at where are we at within our risk tolerance, and do we need to do anything more? The first thing to do is really worry about all of the other pieces, and then you can kind of look at your residual risk after you've implemented something. We always say do something. Don't try to worry about the end goal until you get something in place, and then continually improve as appropriate. So like I kind of said, what do you do first? Make sure you at least understand what the risks are. Understand how you're then going to deal with those risks. Accept them, transfer them, prevent them from occurring to the best of your ability, or do some type of limitation. But really go through and understand what those risks actually are specific to your organization, not just a generic, have we addressed weather? Well, what weather have we addressed, and what weather do we need to address? What about people? What about technology? All of those things at a very specific level. That is what I have for you. Obviously, we'll send this out to you so you have this presentation to refer. But are there any questions? If anything does come up, please feel free to reach out. You've got my contact information there. Feel free to send me an email. You've got my phone number. Feel free to call us. Always happy to take a few minutes, 15, 30 minutes to talk to folks about specific questions, needs. And that's, no salesy at all, right? That's just, if you have a question, feel free to reach out. Happy to answer those questions. If there isn't anything else, please have a good rest of the day. Again, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And good luck for everything that you're doing.